So we're going to start, we'll get right to business. We're going to talk about the Geneva deal. So is this a choice between diplomacy or a march to war? At the Saban Forum this weekend, the president framed the debate on Iran as a choice between a diplomatic approach or a march to war. Senator Menendez criticized this approach, and he said, "What I don't appreciate is when I hear remarks out of the White House saying if we're pursuing sanctions, we're marching the country off to war. I think that's way over the top. I think that's fear-mongering." Where do you stand on Congress's approach to additional sanctions and this fundamental difference in approach between the president and Congress?
First, this is not a process to denuclearize Iran. That will not be the outcome. Iran will be a nuclear state. You've seen it now from the president, let alone the Iranians, saying that enrichment of uranium is a red line they will not allow to be crossed. Despite the fact that the Security Council resolutions say no enrichment, no stockpiles, the agreement that they reached in Geneva, and by the way, the points that the United States put out are not actually from the agreement itself. The version the Iranians put out was the agreement itself. And there, twice it makes reference to enrichment. And so the outcome of this will be, as they outline it now, that Iran will have a capacity for enrichment limited in many ways by monitoring inspections, the degree to which they can enrich. But the very fact they have the capacity undermines the effectiveness of any agreement that we reach. Iran's history is very clear. We have, for more than 20 years, going back to President Bush I, tried to get American governments to pay attention to this nuclear process. It is not something of recent vintage. That has been going on for decades. They have built a huge infrastructure, more and more sophisticated of late, but nonetheless going back many years. And we could have stopped it then. We didn't. We negotiated with them year after year. The European Three negotiated, especially with a man named Rouhani, who is now painted for us as a moderate. Yet when he was the negotiator from 2003 to 2007, prided himself on the fact that he lied, obfuscated, that he mocked his interlocutors in a book he wrote after his term ended, and showed how he was able to bypass all of the restrictions and use the negotiations to buy time and advance their nuclear program. He's doing the same thing now. This Rouhani is not a moderate. He was one of 6 out of 700 candidates who were approved by Khamenei, who still makes the decisions. He was one of those who signed off on the attack against the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires and the Israeli embassy. If you look at the constitution of his government, the defense minister was the leader of the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard, in Beirut that carried out the attack that killed 241 of our Marines. And so with other members of this government as well, and again knowing that it is Khamenei that makes the decisions. Rouhani is a good front. His election was a reflection of the fact that the people of Iran are tired of sanctions. The people of Iran want change. The people of Iran want democracy. They tried to achieve democracy, but the West abandoned them. You remember the Green Revolution after the election of Ahmadinejad. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets. We were in touch with the Iranian opposition. They were so hopeful. They marched by the hundreds of thousands in 20 or 30 different cities, yelling, "We will not die for Gaza. We will not die for Hezbollah. We will die for Iran." A repudiation of the policies of the government and a message to Israel, but more importantly, a message to the world. And in both instances, then and earlier, when the students went out to demonstrate, American officials said we don't get involved in internal politics, and in the other instance, in family feuds. It killed the opposition movements inside Iran in both cases. It was the West that failed the people of Iran. And it's not just the question of the nuclear race. You cannot isolate this if you don't look at the totality of the threat that Iran poses, which is their human rights violations. More than 530 people have been executed so far this year by the Iranian government. More than 300 since Rouhani, the moderate, got elected. Much more than under Ahmadinejad. If you look at their support for global terrorism, not only Hamas and Hezbollah, but in Africa, in South America, in Central America, in the United States, in Canada, and in Mexico. You know, Hezbollah alone makes $1 billion off illicit cigarette sales in the United States and is involved in narco-terrorism, mafia operations, criminal activities of all kinds, which help fund their activities, all of it guided centrally by the government of Iran. So Iran is a global danger. It is a threat. And so I do not think the outcome of this process will be a denuclearized Iran, although that is the only safe outcome. Unfortunately, the references that you made about the choice, a bad agreement will inevitably lead to war. Not just a war between Israel and Iran, but a war between Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, all of the Sunni countries, even others, Turkey, who are scared and more frightened, frankly, than Israel because they say Israel can defend themselves. I have visited these countries over the past year, 18 months, almost all of the Arab countries. And all of a sudden there's a new openness because they believe today that Israel is their only hope. They do not believe America is the hope, and this deal only underscored the reasons for their concern. I will tell you honestly, I wish there could be a negotiated settlement. I would prefer that much more, but the only way you get a negotiated settlement is if they believe that America's will and determination is strong, that the more we show them our strength, when we pulled an aircraft carrier out of the Persian Gulf, we sent them the wrong message. We did it because of sequestration and financial reasons. That's not how they saw it. And we always have to think, especially in the Middle East, not what we mean or what we intend, but how do they perceive it? How do they hear it? How do they look at what we do and what we say? And if they believe again that they can sit down at the negotiating table and run circles around us. Remember, they were bazaris for 2,000 years. They can out-negotiate and out-manipulate us from breakfast on. These are very clever, they're very smart, and they understand that you give the West a nice smile, you try to cajole them. And I don't fault the administration for wanting to reach an agreement. I want to see an agreement. The reason the Iranians came to the table was one reason, and that was the sanctions. The tougher the sanctions, the more committed they will be to reaching an accord. The less the sanctions, the less committed they will be. Assad got rid of the chemical weapons, not because of the nice words, but because our ships were along his borders with the guns trained on Damascus. That is the only language that terrorists understand. And the lesson we have to learn is you have to take dictators seriously. The leaders of Iran keep outlining the red lines. Just see what they've said in the last week. They mean it, and they stick to their red lines. And what do they respect? When we stick to our red lines. When Netanyahu got up in the United Nations and made the bomb, you remember the drawing and the red line? Do you know that the Iranians have never crossed that red line? Even when they started getting close to it, they would take a lot of the stockpiled enriched uranium and convert it, because they wouldn't cross his red line. You know why? Because they really believed him.
So let me ask you about some other red lines. Can Israel live with Iran on the threshold of a nuclear weapon with active enrichment and active Iraq plutonium reactor, if that is the deal that's concluded?
It's not just that Israel can't live with it. I don't think the United States can live with it. This is going to undermine all of our security interests in the region, all of our allies in the region. But more than that, it will set off an arms race, a nuclear arms race. Saudi Arabia can buy it from Pakistan. Others will buy from North Korea. Others will develop it. 14 Arab countries have already applied to develop nuclear capacity. This will turn the region into greater turmoil even than the Arab Spring, because we will see a race to weaponry. Also, things have changed. You know, today we talk about allowing enrichment at 3.5% or 5%, and it may not sound like a lot. And before it was 20%, and the 20% under the deal has to be dismantled. Half will be turned into a gas, which can be converted back. Half will be essentially destroyed. The problem is that with the new centrifuges, more than 1,000 of which have already been installed, there are 19,000 centrifuges operating now in Iran's system, 10,000 operative at any one time. They go directly from 5% to 90%. You don't need to have the interim stages. These are much more advanced, much faster. Before, you would go from 3% to 5% to 10%. Each of these were big leaps. Then 20% was seen as the launching point to 90%, which is weapons grade. That no longer is true. So the rules have changed. When you get past 5%, you're on your way to a nuclear weapon. When you have these huge stockpiles, there's 7 tons of enriched uranium under the agreement that they're allowed to keep. And they're even allowed to enrich another ton, as we only learned afterwards. But they have to, at the end of 6 months, they're supposed to be back to where they started. The Iraq plant is a plutonium heavy water plant which has no civilian purpose whatsoever, which is what they claim this is for. And it is only for weapons purposes. They said they need it for medical isotopes.
And agriculture.
And, yeah, and agriculture for fertilizer, and that's exactly what their argument is, fertilizer. You'll get that later. And I want to go back to the point you asked me before about where we stand on the proposals. Tomorrow, the Senate will take up the bill for additional sanctions.
So this is the Menendez-Kirk?
Menendez-Kirk will most likely be introduced tomorrow. It won't be voted on. It'll be after the recess. I think it's essential because it will not become effective now. It'll have built in to put it into effect in 6 months. What is outrageous is that we should let Zarif threaten us and tell us that we will not adhere, that Iran will not adhere to agreement if the Senate of the United States passes any kind of sanctions bill, even if they don't go into effect now. And we're told, and the president made the reference, others, that this will alienate our allies. It's not true. All the sanctions we kept putting on, everybody said, too much sanctions, you're going to alienate the Iranian people, the opposite. The Iranian people said, more sanctions, more sanctions. The Europeans followed because nobody wants to have to make a choice between doing business with Iran and doing business with the United States. And I think that the message to the Iranians, that if you continue the practice of all the years in the past, that you're going to obfuscate and delay and ask for another 6 months, which is a provision in the agreement, you understand that you're going to face new sanctions. And hanging that over them is effective.
They say that the linchpin, if these sanctions in the Senate are going to come through, is Senator Schumer, our senator here. Any word on where, because Senator Schumer has sort of talked the talk, will Senator Schumer walk the walk and go against the president who said that they'll be counterproductive? Any word about that?
Well, first of all, it's Senator Reid is the key player as the majority leader as to the timing. Senator Menendez of New Jersey and Senator Kirk, who have taken the lead, along with a group of senators, which has included, till now, Senator Schumer. And I am hopeful and confident that Senator Schumer will continue to play a very constructive leadership role in this. I think that the vote in the Congress, despite the pressures from the administration, would be overwhelmingly supportive of it because they get it. They understand what's at stake. What's at stake for America? It's essential to our own defense and security to pass this kind of legislation, which does not impede the hands of the negotiators. What it does is enforce their hand. It gives them greater power to be able to say to the Iranians every time they will, and assuredly they will, seek to delay the negotiations to say, guys, it's not in our control. Those things are going to kick in.
So do you think the president believes that we really can live with Iran under containment like we did with the Russians, mutually assured destruction?
He has always said that he is absolutely against containment, that he will not, that under his presidency, he will not live with an Iran with a nuclear weapon. I believe him that that is his intent. I think this should not be about the president. This should not be ad hominem attacks on the president or anybody else for that matter. We have to talk about the policy, the substance, because it's of such dire consequence. It's of such significance. I don't think people understand what the implications of a nuclear Iran would be. When you have a terrorism support state, and added to that they would have the nuclear umbrella, that they could give to Hezbollah, to Hamas, and have dirty bombs and all of the other ramifications, the intimidation which they practice now. Think of how that would be augmented if they had a nuclear capacity. So it's in everyone's interest not to allow it. You come to definitional points about what does it mean, what we allow. If in fact there are really intrusive inspections, that will be a positive step towards whatever agreement. Nobody denies them, not us, not anyone that I know, the right to have peaceful nuclear capacity. That does not mean enrichment. They keep claiming a right. There is no right to enrichment, nowhere. No country has it. Canada, Mexico have huge nuclear, peaceful nuclear purposes for electricity, but they don't have enrichment. So there is no right to enrich. And Iran, which has 200 years supply of oil and gas for their domestic electric needs if they needed it, even with that, we would have no objection. Bushehr was built by the Russians. They were going to build a second one. Others, as long as the enrichment takes place outside, they were offered to have the enriched uranium provided by outside parties, because it's not what they want. Their goal is a military weapon.
But isn't the horse out of the barn already? Because on page 4 of the Geneva Agreement, it says enrichment. The Iranians say it is a red line. Kenneth Pollack of the Brookings Institute says that if they have any level of enrichment, they will have the ability to have a nuclear weapon at the time of their choosing. So if that's true, how could logically somebody sign the interim agreement without, and putting those words, because it's only a 4-page agreement. We're not talking about 2,000 pages of the healthcare bill here. We're talking about a simple agreement. Putting those words in meant something. And the president re-emphasized this week in Saban that you cannot realistically expect them to give that up, despite what the UN resolutions are. So how can one come away thinking that the president has anything but containment? And many people say that's actually a realistic thing. George Will actually wrote about it today. So I'm going to go back to that question. What's wrong with containment if with this, why can't we deal with them like the Russians?
If you were dealing with a sane regime, I think people would feel that we have more room for flexibility. You're not. You're dealing with the leading state sponsor driven by a wild ideology, an extremist philosophy that allows them to hang gays, priests, Baha'is, Christians, execute them at will, that persecutes their own people, that is involved in terrorism activity and terrorism support around the world, that has proven that they will take advantage of every situation. They want to have the capacity. Once you have the infrastructure in place, if we leave it with no dismantling, which is what they said, as you pointed out, was a red line, and is not what the UN Security Council calls for, they will get to the breakout point, just as they have now. We don't know about secret facilities, by the way, and we have ample reports that there are additional facilities that we haven't. We've no inspections yet at Parchin, where they did weaponization. The agreement doesn't even touch on the issue of their ballistic missile system, and today, the Minister of Defense put out a statement that they have now redefined and refined their nuclear guidance, their missile guidance system, that it used to become within 200 meters of a target, now to 2 meters of a target. They have thousands of missiles and many long-range ballistic missiles with 2,000-kilometer range. They are going to get to 3,000 kilometers, which is 2,000 miles, meaning they're going to cover all of Europe, and they will hit the east coast of the United States before long. Not years away, short period. So you have 3 parts in a nuclear program. Enrichment, they have the facility, and Fordo is one, Natanz. These are underground many times. Some of them are built inside mountains. They are almost impenetrable, except to Stuxnet and other things that are very successful in eliminating some of the nuclear scientists who meet these tragic accidents in the streets of Tehran. And then you have the weaponization, which we believe is more advanced than they're saying. And there's nothing in the deal that's in the agreement that says they have to stop. The weaponization, the research and development, manufacturing, many things are allowed under the agreement. Now, the answer that is given is that this is an interim agreement. This is not what the final agreement will say. But the fact is that once you set these standards, you're not going to be able, it's going to be very hard to go further and go backwards on them without giving the Iranians the clear message that we are determined, and that the other options, as the president said again at Saban, all options are on the table. The military option is on the table. The question is, do the Iranians believe it's on the table? And the essential part of this is that containment is a license for them to move ahead.
So you've made a compelling case that this is not just about Israel, this is about the world. So have we in the American Jewish community made a strategic mistake in emphasizing Iran being an existential issue to Israel, but not emphasizing the strategic American security interest here or to the world, have we ourselves made a mistake in not bringing up the American component?
I don't think that the American Jewish community has made an error. The American Jewish community has always said that this was about the United States. I remember talking to former President Bush, who often talked about Iran and would say things like, this is a great danger to our ally Israel, and I would say, you know, that doesn't help us. Talk about it as a great danger to America. It is a danger to the United States, to its interests at home and abroad. And for the American people to be prepared for whatever option, and if military option is one, it's the last one. It's absolutely the last. It's not what Israel wants. It's not what we want. It's not what I think the United States Senate wants. But the only way you avoid it is by being strong and showing the message. So I think that Netanyahu's role has been extremely constructive, that if it weren't for him, I think a lot of the opposition and that this process would have been much further advanced. On the other hand, because he's the Prime Minister of Israel and because he's been sometimes the lone voice out there, it has become Israel-centric. I think that is not good, and it shouldn't be Jewish-centric. And what we have done, and what I think the American Jewish community is certainly moving towards, is emphasizing the danger to the United States and to our allies collectively, to see that Saudi Arabia, which loves to see Israel out there fighting, you know, and some of the leaders of the Arab countries said to me, we pray that Israel will deal with the enemy. We'll condemn them, but we pray for them. I also want to say one other thing. You know, we're now only in the interim agreement. This is not the agreement. We're not in the stage yet. Now they're negotiating the application and implementation of the Geneva. So we don't even know what the full definitions will be. That's one of the things that they did not say at the beginning, that there is an interim period. So the agreement, the 6 months, won't even begin until probably mid-January. During this time, the IEA is supposed to already start their inspections and guaranteeing that all of the stockpiles meet the requirements, et cetera. Then we're going to start negotiating and see what the final agreement will be.
So let's talk about another facet of the agreement, the loosening of the sanctions. And so I'll just give you a couple of things that have happened since the Geneva Agreement. Al Arabia reported of a joint Iranian-United States Chamber of Commerce is in the works. The International New York Times reported that the Iran-Pakistani gas pipeline is back online. The Times of India reported India is accelerating the major Iranian port project. Reuters reported that Iran is resuming gold trade with Turkey and easing on a ban of European insurance and reinsurance. So if the deal in 6 months is not completed, do you believe these nations will revert to sanctions again, and it will be against their own economic interests? Is this something that we can stop? Will these nations respect it if things don't work out?
Yes.
You really believe that?
Again, it's a very complex question. Sanctions are as much economic as they are psychological. And the question is, are we breaking the psychological barrier which we've brought countries to over an extended period where they will buy into the sanctions regime? And I must say that the Treasury Department of the United States has done an exceptional job under Stuart Levy, under now David Cohen, I guess the next guy's name will be Israel, that really put the sanctions regime in place. And they're very dedicated efforts, and we have to give credit to this administration and previous, but certainly under this administration they've been enforced much greater, to greater effect. And it affects their key areas. The new legislation, by the way, only targets 3 things: strategic companies, the remaining oil sector exports, which are still 1 million barrels a day under this agreement, will reach 1 million, and banking. When you can't bank, if you can sell whatever you want, but if you have no place to put the money, if you can't transfer the money, that's critical. There are tens of billions of dollars of Iranian money sitting in banks around the world because of the frozen assets. So what the United States is saying is that we're going to free up in increments, and with implementation, they say it'll amount to $7 billion. Others say it'll amount to a much greater amount. And once you start freeing up the funds, like the Chinese have $20 billion, and they said, look, we'll build facilities in Tehran for $20 billion, and you will use the money that you had in the accounts being held in Chinese banks, and that they would take the money out of that. So there are many ways, once you start getting on that slippery slope, that is the concern, is that it's very hard to stop. Second, many companies, for instance, German companies, have been continuing to sell dual-use technology stuff. 5,000 German companies were trading with Iran. That number has been cut significantly. Italian companies, British companies, others. Some continued under various subterfuges through secondary routes. They've been caught, they've been sanctioned, companies paid huge fines. Insurance companies can no longer insure the shipping of Iranian boats, which also cuts back and helps reinforce the infrastructure. But once you see this, as you pointed out, some of the steps, the Pakistani oil pipeline, that started before this, that they already had that in place and they were talking about activating it. But other things, the auto show that was taking place this week in Tehran had 15 registrants before the sanctions were lifted. Now the thing was sold out. And the auto parts, is part of the sanctions relief, that they're allowed to have these kits for auto repairs and to build autos. But they also, that was the cover for a lot of the dual-use technology for missile development were included in the sales of parts and for machinery and for car production. So it's a cover when you break on that. On airplane parts is another one of the exemptions that they're supposed to get. They are in limited areas, but gold trade is another. So they're opening up new processing plants. This will be $1 billion for Iran again. We don't want to punish the people of Iran. We don't sanction medicine, we didn't sanction foodstuffs, we didn't sanction other things that go directly to the people. But the people have said, you know what, we're prepared to take and suffer if it helps us get rid of this oppressive regime. And the message that we have to send is that we are indeed with them, that we support them, and that the European countries who are all too anxious to get back in line, and none of them want to be at the end of the line. So now they're going to take advantage to get in front and be there, be prepared. But at the same time, they don't want to invest if they think in 6 months the sanctions are going to kick back and they will be back to where they were. So we have to make it clear the sanctions will never be relaxed until there's a final deal, and a final deal that's enforced, and even after it's enforced, to see to it that they are in compliance for a long period.
So you were saying you're in favor of increased sanctions, but the president gave waivers to every single one of the Iranian trading partners of the original sanctions, and the Daily Beast reported recently that through State Department documents that the president stopped enforcing sanctions once President Rouhani was elected as a goodwill gesture. So why do we need new sanctions? Shouldn't the old sanctions be good enough if the president fully enforced them?
Well, no, because these things go further into the core areas of banking and oil, which is we need to maximize the leverage, because that's also their major source of income, and also their ability to trade, that even if there are cheaters, if the cheaters can't use the banks, then it negates a lot of the benefit. So one, on the report, I don't know whether it's true or not that they relaxed it. We've tried to find out. I'm told that it isn't true. I can't say for sure. But so the new sanctions cover additional areas, reinforce the existing sanctions. And you said about the exemptions. The exemptions were for particular countries on the condition that they reduced their imports of oil from Iran by 18%. Now they said we've reached the bottom line that we can't reduce it further. We can reduce it further. Countries like Japan, India were given waivers. They continue to export. They did billions of dollars in business, which helps Iran to continue its activities. I think the exemptions are a mistake. They felt that that was the only way that they could continue to carry out the sanctions.
So before we get on to our next major topic, I want to ask one last question about the secret negotiations. So at the Saban Forum, President Obama was asked about the secret talks that Israel is excluded from, and he said, quote, "There were not a lot of secret negotiations. We were clear and transparent," unquote. But according to Reuters and the Associated Press, U.S. and Iranian officials met secretly in such out-of-the-way places as Oman, using military planes, side entrances, and service elevators to conceal their efforts to lay the ground for the nuclear agreement. The contacts were confirmed by U.S. officials. At the conference, the president said, quote, "You can be sure that the strongest nation in the world is taking care of your Israel security." So are you confident that the United States will not strike a final deal with Iran in secret, leaving the Israelis out?
You know, the Chinese say prophecy is very difficult, especially about the future. I don't know what will come. I don't believe that President Obama or any president of the United States could actually carry that out and get away with it. They may do things in secret. There may be secret understandings. The fact that these negotiations took place with Ahmadinejad. It wasn't when Rouhani started. We started these negotiations 18 months ago, and when I kept asking the administration about it, and I say, look, are there talks going on? I don't want the details, I'm just asking you, because we heard from Arab sources, I heard from intelligence sources in Iran, I heard from other people we were meeting with that there were talks going on. And they said, negotiations going on. And when it came out, obviously, that there had been, I said, how could you not tell me? They said, well, you asked about negotiations. These weren't negotiations, they were talks. If it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's negotiations. So I don't believe that Israel can ever put its trust in anyone other than its own IDF capacity and its own ability to defend itself, its interests, and it has to put that first and foremost. And as friendly as governments are, and I don't believe this president or any president is anti-Israel or hates Israel, or the American people overwhelmingly are pro-Israel. The Congress votes 100-0 on bills dealing with the Congress. Not even motherhood and apple pie get 100-0 votes. I mean, there's nothing but Israel that gets that kind of support. It's not something we can take for granted. It's not a guarantee. But Israel ultimately has to be able to defend itself, has to have the capacity to do it. They need us to be there as a front line in making their case so that whatever action is taken, that the American people understand why it's necessary. You'll be surprised how many Americans look to Israel for leadership on this issue. You saw the polls that show that 43% of the American people do not support the president on this deal. 25% are undecided, which means there's not a big percentage supporting it. And the American people are war-weary. It's true. Americans don't want another war. They don't want to be involved in another situation in the Middle East. But if they would understand what's really at stake, and I want to take 1 minute just to put this into context, to understand what's really at stake here. You know, I visited Egypt right after the revolution there when Mubarak was overthrown. And I came back and I said, and some people here heard me speak about this many times, that what's happening in the Middle East is not about democracy. There are people who want democracy. I met the young Democrats in Egypt. But if you remember, it started in Tunisia because of a guy's cart that was taken away. Remember in Tunis? This was first and foremost about economy, about jobs, about food. Food went up 100% in the first 3 months of that year. People couldn't afford to feed their families. 40% of the people in Egypt make $2 a day at that time. Today, it's over 50%. Their foreign reserves have been depleted. They face terrible situations. And there's nothing that drives people in the street more than an empty stomach. And the Muslim Brotherhood were very clever because they put up front people who didn't look like Muslim Brotherhood, even though they were manipulating from behind, because they knew the Western reaction wouldn't be as supportive. So first and foremost, this has been about food, jobs, economy. Second, it's about failed states. Syria is not a real country. I met Assad 2 months before the fighting started in Syria. And he said to me then, if what happened in Egypt, where it already happened, happens here, I will never step down because I will get out, but they will massacre the Alawites. I know how much they hate them. And I told this to the administration when the fighting started, that this is not going to be like Gaddafi or Mubarak. This guy's going to fight to the end, and we should identify people now that we can support. Unfortunately, Syria, unlike Egypt, which is a real country and has an identity as Egyptians, you don't even call them Arabs because they get insulted. They want to be known as Egyptians. Syrians don't have a common identity. They're Sunni, Shiites, Christians, Alawites, Huranis, they're Kurds, but they're not Syrians. This was imposed upon them by the colonials. Libya is 147 tribes. Morocco is a real country. And they have a Moroccan identity. The king, I think, has been brilliant in his way he's tried to execute. Yemen is not a real country. Divided north-south, they're divided by tribes. keeping it together with Scotch tape. Iraq today is in a civil war. Lebanon is facing a civil war. So it's about failed states and failed governments. Third, the internet revolution helped people communicate in ways that they couldn't before. And fourth, this is essentially the Sunni-Shiite battle of 1,000 years standing. And if you don't see that, you can't understand what's really happening. This is not, take Syria. This is not a battle just between Assad and the rebels. It's Russia versus the United States. It's Turkey versus Iran. It's Sunnis versus Shiites. It's Christians and Alawites versus... It's many other battles. There are layer upon layer of complication. But fundamentally in the region, it's a battle for who's going to have hegemony. And you have four drives for empires. You have Iran trying to reestablish the Persian Empire. And for them, it goes through Syria to Hezbollah and Hamas on the Mediterranean, down through eastern Iraq into the Gulf. The Ottomans, i.e. Turkey and the crazy man Erdogan, want to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, which also goes through Syria, Iraq, and down to the Gulf. Then you have the Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia trying to move up the other way, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who created an empire from Egypt to Morocco, winning every election, but thank God it's crumbling. That's what this battle is about. And if you don't understand the context, and the fulcrum of it is what happens in Iran. If Iran goes nuclear, all of these battles become then so exasperated. And you could turn this whole, quote, Arab Spring, which it never was, into a conflagration that we can't even understand the dimension of.
I want to focus on one of the things you talked about, which is Egypt. When I was in Israel, the leadership wanted me to tell Congress that please support al-Sisi because he has turned smuggling through the Philadelphia corridor down to zero, that he's cleaning up the jihadists. But yet we hear many voices saying on a moral basis that we should not support an authoritarian government against a democracy. How should the American Jewish community respond?
Look, nobody's going to say that al-Sisi is a saint or that this is the kind of government. We all want to see democracy in every country. I just explained to you why, in some instances, democracy can't work. You need a strong leader to keep a country like Libya together. I'm not saying it shouldn't be democratic and people want their rights and they should be given it. But when you face a situation in Egypt where the choice is between the Muslim Brotherhood and their views and their goals were clear, and we saw at Morsi, who had the chance to try and introduce democratic reforms in his time, he didn't do it. He did the opposite. And al-Sisi, who at least has been fighting the terrorists, he's fighting a battle in the Sinai, which gets very little attention, but it is like another Somalia. You have 16, 17 terrorist organizations, you have offshoots of al-Qaeda, you have huge stockpiles of weapons coming from Libya into the Sinai and from Gaza, and they transfer back and forth. And the Egyptian government has finally really they've taken troops with Israel's backing, and they're going into these areas or permission from Israel. And the same thing in Gaza. The Egyptians closed hundreds of tunnels, which Mubarak didn't do and Morsi didn't do. They have acted against the extremists inside Gaza. They sent drones in, and they told them, you continue to support the terrorists, and we're going to send in our army. So the message that the al-Sisi government sent is really critical. So it's not ideal, but you got to look at it in relevant and relative terms to see where is it that we should be backing. And to me, the choice is clear. We want stability for Egypt. Once Egypt has stability, then the people can elect governments that really reflect their interests and the long-term democratic and other goals that we hope for the country.
So let's move on to an easier topic, the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations.
Yes, simple stuff.
President Obama said in March that, quote, the Palestinians must recognize that Israel will be a Jewish state. Last Thursday, Secretary of State Kerry said that a peace agreement would need to, quote, recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Yet, President Abbas has repeatedly said he cannot accept a Jewish state of Israel because it would deny the rights of the 20% of Israel's population that is Palestinian. But President Abbas has said, quote, we don't accept the Jewish state or the Jewishness of the state, which is obviously opposite what the UN Resolution 181 had said, calling for an Arab and a Jewish state. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, unless the Palestinians recognize the Jewish state and give up on the right of return, there will be no peace, because generation of incitement. We have no confidence that such recognition will percolate down to the Palestinian people. And they back it up with Palestinian polls of Palestinians. 72% of Palestinians reject any Jewish connection to the land or Jerusalem. 88% of Palestinians believed in armed struggle. 61% do not accept two states for two people. And less than a third think that the Palestinian Authority is trustworthy. So can Israel trust the current Palestinian leadership and sign a deal that does not recognize Israel as a Jewish state?
We don't need their recognition that Israel is a Jewish state. Israel is a Jewish state because for 3,000 years it is our homeland. It is the only place on earth where the people today speak the same language, have the same religion, follow the same goals, have the same territory that they had 3,000 years ago. There's no other place. No place that's been sanctified by blood and tears and sweat and prayers for people over all generations through all the torturous existence that our people have had. So I don't need Abbas or Arafat or anybody else to tell me that this is a Jewish state. This is the Jewish homeland, it's a Jewish land.
Wouldn't it show their sincerity if they did
that? Now, I'll come to that in a second, but I think it's important that we understand what is it that the question, that your important question raises. It's not whether he recognizes it. You know, the first Rashi in Chumash in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, says, why does the Bible begin with the story of creation and not with the first mitzvah, which is a mitzvah of sanctifying the new moon, Rosh Chodesh? And it says, he says, written more than 1,000 years ago, because the time will come when the nations of the world will say, Listim atem, you're robbers, you stole the land. And you will answer, God created the earth. He gave this land to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their wives for all their generations that follow. It's a bond stronger than any, that no time, no enemy, no force, no nuclear weapons, nothing can break. And therefore, it has to start with the story of creation to legitimize our claim. So I have a better deed than anything Arafat can say. There never was a Palestinian state. I don't say a Palestinian shouldn't be recognized in whatever outcome of negotiations. There's no country that has more of a claim of legitimacy, yet it's the only country whose credentials are challenged. And the incitement of the Palestinian Authority is an outrage that they're training generation after generation to hate, that Israel can do so many things on behalf of each of its neighbors. The fact that people from Gaza, including the children of Hamas leaders, come to Israel to be treated in their hospitals, and the tons and tons that go in every day. You saw what they did with the concrete. They built underground tunnels into Israel using the very concrete that they were complaining Israel limits for that very reason, because we know how they diverted. So the question then becomes, why is Netanyahu making issue of this recognition? Because it goes to the core. If you're never going to have peace, if they're not ready to recognize the existence, the vitality, the right of the Jews to a Jewish state, and that this land is not in Uganda. You know, they asked Herzl why he didn't accept the offer of Uganda, and he said, it's like asking me why I travel hundreds of miles to visit my grandmother when there are a lot of old ladies nearby I could see. We have one land, one place, and the recognition by the Palestinians, in the same way that they demand that there be a recognition, and by the way, it's not Israeli-Palestinians, they're Israeli-Arab citizens. I think the term Israeli-Palestinian is not a helpful one. I think it obfuscates and it's used by some government officials as well. I think words count, and we have to be very careful about the words. When we talk about occupation, we talk about other things, as Bennett said, you can't call me an occupier when I'm in my home. And the right of Jews, we can talk about what can be negotiated, and I think, and I pray that there will be a peaceful settlement that will enable all the people to live in peace. I think everybody wants their children to live in peace. But when you train your children to kill, when you train them and say to them, and I have witnessed some of these things, when they put them in coffins in the ground and train them with the belief of the virgins and all the other things that they're going to get, if they kill a Jew, if they take little children and on their Sesame Street program tell them if you kill one Jew and another Jew, how many Jews have you killed, you'll never have peace. So for that reason alone, the American government, the international community has to clamp down The president raised it with Abbas, and he stands at the White House and says, there is no incitement to the president of the United States. And yet we see the constant diet of incitement. So the red line has to be recognized that there is a Jewish state of the Jewish people in which all people can be citizens, Christians, Muslims, Baha'i, everybody can have rights. Remember, the one place where Arabs can vote freely for Arabs for the parliament is in Israel. And the only place in the Middle East where over the last 40 years the Christian population has increased rather than being massacred and discriminated and driven out is Israel. So Israel recognizes that right and its obligation. It's not always perfect and it makes mistakes, we agree. But the Palestinians have to say to their own people, you got to come to terms with this or never will be peace.
So it gets to the source of the conflict. Prime Minister Netanyahu said the core of this conflict has never been about borders and settlements. It's about one thing, the persistent refusal to accept the Jewish state in any border. Bughi Ya'alon said this week, as someone who supported the Oslo Accords, I'm learning that we have no partner on the other side. Yet we have new labor leader Bughi, Isaac Herzog said, quote, we have a partner that is ready to go the distance for peace and take original, brave steps on core issues. Which is it?
Look, you can have differences of views. There can be, Herzog is obviously trying to establish himself as a leader. He's an old friend and very articulate and hopefully will give new life to the Labor Party as it is. But the bottom line facts are the facts established by Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. Listen to what they say. Look at what they do. And then that's the answer. The truth is obvious. Now, do we want to try and change that? Do we want to try and facilitate things and have negotiations? There are ongoing negotiations. The Palestinians, again, are refusing the right of Jews to live in their land, the right of Jews even to own land. You know, it's punishable by death in these lands. And we can't just, close our eyes to that reality. So the truth lies in trying to bring together the two parties, but on a realistic basis if we want there to be peace. I think the threats of a third intifada are a big mistake. I don't think it's true, and I think when Secretary Kerry mentioned it, I don't think that was his intent. I think he was trying, and his references to Israel's isolation because of all of this, that's not how you're going to achieve peace. It'll be when the Palestinians see it's in their interest, that it's in the interest of the Palestinian people. They're not doing it for Israel. They're doing it for their own sake, just as Israel, when it makes peace, is doing it for the Israeli people.
I wanted to talk a little about American Jewry and the question of the occupation of these disputed territories. There are some Americans who believe that for Israel's own good, Israel must be pressured into withdrawing from the communities in Judea and Samaria. They've been even described as a drunk driver, the Israelis, and you have to take away the keys and not give them tequila. Countering this argument, some pro-Israel Americans say that American Jewry who does not put their own children in harm's way, does not have to live with the consequences of imposed solutions, should not tell a sovereign people what's right for them. So there's a lot of divisiveness within our American Jewish community who love Israel of what is best. So what is the role for American Jewry in regard to Israeli communities over the Green Line? And what should we be saying and doing?
You know, people who have no responsibility and no power can say anything they want. That's why radical leaders can say anything. People for whom there are no consequences for what they say can say anything. American Jews are perceived to be powerful. We're perceived by the world to be powerful. Therefore, what we say and what we do matters. And then when, in that regard, you have to think about your responsibility. It's very easy to make glorious declarations, but you got to think about what are the consequences. It's not our children there on the front lines. Go to Israel, vote the government out, protest, do whatever you want. That certainly is the first response. But I believe American Jews have a right to have a view on everything related to Israel. I think they have a right to express those views in responsible ways. But you got to think about the consequences, short-term and long-term. It's not enough just to get on a talk show, you know, and people scream and yell as they do. I do the Bachelor show twice a week, and thank God we don't take phone calls, but I listen to some of the others, and you see that people can just say whatever they want. They don't think about what is the consequence to millions of people who hear that message. What is the message when the Jewish community appears to be divided? So I think that Jews have a right to express their views. I have reservations when it comes to defense and security issues. Ultimately, those decisions rest with the people of Israel, who have to live and die by the consequences of those decisions and by the decisions of their democratically elected government. I think we have to think about the consequences and the impact of what we say. Do we confuse our elected officials? Do we diminish support on the vital issues on which we agree? And the truth is, the President's Conference represents people from left to right, a whole spectrum, from Peace Now to ZOA, all the religious streams. And I would say on 95% of the issues, we can find common ground. And then you build an atmosphere of respect in which we can deal with the other issues. And again, I believe people have a right to have and believe what they want, but it should be based on facts, on information, and how you give voice to it has to be carefully considered as to the consequences for the people of Israel and for Jewish security.
So the last question is on delegitimization of Israel, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. A harsh critic of the Israeli government and a leader in advocating for BDS against Jews living in Judea and Samaria wrote in the New York Times, "We should call Judea and Samaria non-democratic Israel and Israel within the Green Line flawed but democratic Israel. Having made that rhetorical distinction, we should lobby to exclude settler-produced goods from America's free trade deal with Israel. We should push to end Internal Revenue Service policies that allow Americans to make tax-deductible gifts to settler charities. Every time an American newspaper calls Israel a democracy, we should urge it to include the caveat only within the Green Line." So how do you respond to those who advocate for the BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions against Jewish products from beyond or over the Green Line?
Okay. First of all, who do you punish by these boycotts of the West Bank? You punish 30,000 Palestinians who are working in the settlements, in factories in the settlements, who feed their families, who get equal pay with Israelis. And I can tell you, when the first call for boycott, I got a call from the mayor of one of the big Palestinian cities saying to me, I count that you guys are not going to allow this to happen. He said, because I have 3,000 people from here who work in Ma'ale Adumim, in the SodaStream factory and other places. They get the equal pay with Israelis. He said, if they close down, then these guys are going to come back here. They're going to make, instead of 2,000 a month, 200 a month, and they're going to become terrorists and my problem. So one, people have to understand the consequences of these calls. Again, when you see people make these declarations blindly without thinking of what it really means. Second, the BDS movement is not about the settlements. It's not about 67, it's about 47. It's about Israel's right to exist. People are going to have different views about what to do in the settlements, etc. But that's not what the delegitimization movement is about. And it's really critical that everybody not get hung up on this word, which nobody can spell and nobody knows what delegitimization means. What it means is denying the rights of the Jewish people and the Jewish state to the status of all other people, the rights of national aspiration of the Jewish people. That is what the delegitimization is not about what happened in 67. It's about 47, about Israel's right to exist. And when you deny Israel as the corporate Jew, because it's still not politically correct to say I hate Jews, but you can't say I hate Israel. You can say I hate Zionists. Increasingly, you can't say I hate Jews in many places. But this becomes the forum to attack Jews in a politically acceptable way, to say, oh, it's not Jews, it's only those Jews. It's those Israelis for what they do, the apartheid state, all the lies, all of the manipulation of facts, all of the distortions. Israel's record can stand against any country in the world, including our own. Do they make mistakes? 100%. Israel's not Disneyland. Sometimes it's Never Neverland, but it's not Disneyland. It lives in a really bad neighborhood and it faces real challenges. And if you look at how they conducted themselves, look at all the false information. The problem today is, despite the information revolution, you can't believe what you hear, you can't believe what you read, you can't even believe what you see. We saw on the front page of the New York Times picture during the Gaza conflict of a man carrying a baby released by the UN office in Gaza, saying that this child was killed, a 7-year-old, by an Israeli plane. And the Israelis said we weren't even flying. And it turned out that she had been killed in an auto accident 7 years earlier. That this was pictures that were put in the newspapers of children killed in the Sinai, in Syria, attributed to Israel. The Reuters reporter painted fake planes bombing Lebanese sites, and 900 pictures had to be removed from their archives. So even things you yourself saw and you said, but I saw it, I believe it, are lies. You know, Mark Twain once said, if you don't read a newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read a newspaper, you're ill-informed. The problem is today that you cannot believe it. You know how many lies, and you see the extent of it, and the readiness of people to accept it, even in our own community, when there are false criticisms, how many people fall for it until it's disproven, until you find out, well, it wasn't the case. You know, and they caught sharks, attacked people swimming off the coast of Sinai. And the Egyptians said these were Mossad-trained sharks trying to destroy the tourism industry. Then Saudi Arabia, these are all true, downed a vulture, which Israel had tagged because they checked the migration patterns. And they held it for 3 months in jail until they found out it was a bird, not a drone. The Iranian, and by the way, 4 other countries in the Middle East did the same thing. I'm not kidding. The Iranians, not to be outdone, executed 6 squirrels whom they say were trained by the Mossad to infiltrate their nuclear program. You laugh. Hundreds of millions of people believe it. Hundreds of millions of people see it on the internet, on cable television stations, on Al Manar and Al Hura and Al Jazeera. They believe it, including many in our own country. That's why you have to be careful about what you say. That's why you have to be careful about how you present the facts, why you have to educate, why we have to bring people along. We have to think about how do they hear the messages, not just what we want to say and get, you know, all our anger out and all the frustration out. That's not constructive. The American people want to be with us. We have big problems around the world, the growth of anti-Semitism. It's concomitant with delegitimization. This is so important. People don't understand. This is a challenge for our generation, but for our children and our grandchildren will pay the price if we fail to stand up to this issue. Because it means us. They don't mean Israel alone. Israel's the corporate entity. It's the collective Jew. But they mean all of us. And our history shows that it's we who raise the bar on what we will tolerate. Martin Luther King once said, we won't be judged by the attacks of our enemies, but by the silence of our friends. When we don't stand up, when we don't speak up for Israel, whatever criticisms you have, when our friends don't stand up because we don't, then we are undermining the security and safety of future generations, of our grandchildren and their grandchildren. History shows us that we raise the bar and we will tolerate. It goes back to the slavery in Egypt when it keeps saying we could take more, we'll take more, less bricks, more straw. It happened in the 1930s. Everybody said, no, it can't get worse. You know, they cut us off from commerce, education. Think how much worse. The Nazis will never be able to implement it. We have to draw the line and say no more. We're not going to tolerate. We're not going to tolerate the slander against Jews. We're not going to allow the slander against the state of Israel. You have legitimate criticism, say it. Being a critic of Israel policy or something doesn't make you an anti-Semite. Or 98% of Israelis would be anti-Semites. But this is not the nature of the criticism that we're talking about. This goes to the core of Israel's right to exist, of the Jewish people to exist, to have the same rights and expressions of every other people on earth.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.